Oliver winning the die roll starts things off. Tundra into Ponder. Actually, that is Sam. Correction, that's going to switch in just a second here.
Just give it a second. This never happens.
Yeah, this is for Oliver, this is the Buried Alive version, similar to what we saw yesterday, and also we saw do very well in the hands of Tommy Ashton back in Baltimore.
Ashton went 15-1 that event?
14. Yeah, 1 loss.
Right.
X and 1.
Right.
The first one was a lot. And we do see Cabal Therapy from Sam. Naming Force of Will, and it hits. And now the coast is clear for Tomajko. Yeah, he hits the Force of Will. So we get then Petal, Dark Ritual, Buried Alive. Okay, don't mind if I do. Here's 3 Arclight Phoenix.
Right, and these are the kinds of draws that we were talking about going into it where, right, Miracles, given enough time, can answer anything. They have Council's Judgment, Swords to Plowshares, and so forth. But
yeah,
this is just 3 creatures.
And I love the follow-up from Tomajko. Because he doesn't want something like Terminus to be able to be set up, he actually, after post-combat, he therapies away the Brainstorm from Sam's hand. And that's because it doesn't really change the clock, bringing from 9 to 6. It's 2 more hits either way. It's a heads-up play from Oliver.
Exactly. It prevents Roukas from putting back any copies of Terminus that he might be able to find off a Ponder or something to that effect. And then also hides one of them, as you mentioned.
Drawing another Cabal Therapy does Oliver. Just continue to pick things apart, and that's what he'll do. And in response, Swords to Plowshares from Sam, and Oliver's going to daze it. He is at the ready with everything here, and he successfully names Terminus. He again hits the correct cards, and by the way, that was spell number 3, Preordained Therapy and Daze. Sam is down to 1.
All Modern Horizons jokes aside, Tomajko is a fairly experienced Cabal therapist. He picked up a win in the...
He hasn't missed yet.
Right. He picked up a win in the Classic with Legacy Grixis Delver in Baltimore last year. And we ended up playing against each other a few weeks later, and he was just incredible.
And some short work there. Tomajko goes up 1-0 over Roukas. And this is where it just feels so unfair, because Grixis Phoenix is still a fair deck. It plays a lot of interactive cards. But then he just does that on turn 2 to his opponents in this kind of matchup.
That was turn 1.
Yeah, okay, right. Sam has turn 1. Yes, turn 1.
That was...
it was the second turn. So yeah, I was counting the nonsense
1,
way.
Cabal Therapy, you take your Force. Lotus Petal, Dark Grit, Buried Alive, 9 use, sacrifice Arclight Phoenix, Cabal Therapy, your Brainstorm, enjoy your
That's gonna raise Storm. That's just great.
Oh yeah, it's totally normal things going on. And those are the games that Grixis is going to win and line up pretty well against anything, right? You know, you mentioned that being able to raise Storm, the Dazes, the Hand Disruption, there are disruptive elements to this Phoenix deck. The Hand Disruption is something that every few years we just kind of get to see Thoughtseize therapy decks take over the format as a whole because it's proactive interaction, right? You don't get the situation where you get to time to try and thread your cards around Spell Pierce and Daze. You just kind of get them taken by Hand Disruption.
And there's not really a defense, right? Sam can't Force of Will the therapy because then the Force is gone. The only thing Oliver's clearing the way for is a Force of Will on Buried Alive. So there's just, you know, I'd want to say what can Sam board against that kind of draw, but the answer is nothing.
Yeah, there's not too much that can end up looking that great, especially if Roukas is on the draw. Luckily, Roukas will be on the play for Game 2, which means he has access to things like Flusterstorm, Spell Pierce. So you have cards where you can say, if you have Force blue card and then 1-drop Counterspell, you can counter the Cabal Therapy with whatever your 1-drop Counterspell is, and then Force of Will the payoff card, in this context, Buried Alive.
Yeah, I'm looking over the sideboard for Sam. He does have Containment Priest.
That card is nice.
That'll work. That'll play here. He has 2 Surgical Extraction as well. That actually would be a way to interact.
Right, and well, if it doesn't get therapied.
You can't therapy both the Forceful and the Surgical.
You can't. Tomajko can.
Well, I guess the problem is he'll therapy one of them, then see you have the other, and he won't go for it.
Exactly.
My plan needs revising. See, start Tomajko on Ponder. This time Sam gets him on the play. He gets an island onto the board. Maybe he can Flusterstorm something.
Ponder is not as good as last game's start.
3 Flusterstorms and a Spell Pierce all on the board for Roukas. He really gets to improve his deck for game 2.
Right. There are just so many things that are just not that great in your main deck because they take time. Right, Back to Basics, for example, is something that looks good at a glance because this Phoenix deck is a 3-color deck that has a mana-intensive early turns that Back to Basics looks good against. But if you're reaching that phase of the game,
it looks
how hard is it to actually win the game if you aren't so far behind on board that Back to Basics?
It looks a little slow based on what I saw last game.
Yeah, you don't say.
Yeah, you know. You could get hit for 9, and you can show your opponent, but I have this Back to Basics. And they say, yeah, you sure do.
I assume you've had that interaction with people in Blood Moon and Modern.
I mean,
where you just amuleted people, and you have like 2 Primeval Titans in play, and they Blood Moon you, and you just laugh at them?
No, I always lose to the Blood Moon. I've never beat it. That would be nice, though. That story you're telling, I would love. That would be great.
Yeah,
I'm looking forward to the day that happens.
I think I'm mixing up you and Edgar Magalish.
Yeah, somehow he just doesn't lose. Those players don't lose to Blood Moons. I don't know.
Have you tried
I don't understand it. No, I could. That's a good idea.
Yeah, you could stand to do that.
Yeah.
Me too. Don't get me wrong. This isn't me saying I am, right? But
I should just get better.
Calls him like I sees it.
Bunch of cantrips from Tomajko. We do see Counterbalance from Sam.
That card coming down is a very big deal just because so many of the things that Tomajko does are just 1-mana cards that allow him to sort of spin his wheels.
I love this take. This is 2 copies. You don't see this very much anymore.
Oh, absolutely. Without Sensei's Divining Top turning this into a one-sided Chalice of the Void, it's kind of fallen out of favor for the most part, but a lot of these Miracle decks do play 2 of them because they have so many fetch lands, brainstorms, etc., that setting up cards is good.
Misses on the Counterbalance. So Oliver will get to Brainstorm. That's spell number 1. See if we can put more together. Thoughtseize. Let's attempt to spell number 2, but it looks like Sam has a response. It might just be Counterbalance flipping. He's cracking a fetch land here.
Yeah, at this point, if you know you're going to do the fetch land anyway, you might as well just go for it.
And he does. Brainstorm counters the Thoughtseize, and Oliver has to pass.
Boom.
Now, speaking of having to pass, Sam does not have a land either. And it is going to be, I believe, Snarethopter.
Caw. All right, flip the Jace.
Snapcaster Mage on Brainstorm. Does he have a 4-mana card he can put on top?
Jace.
Jason, then you put that Arclight Phoenix in the graveyard. No, he takes 4.
Look, if it's a free, it's just a free way to gain 3 life.
Okay, well, he put Terminus on top. That'll work. And that doesn't counter Arclight Phoenix.
Gonna have him put that Snapcaster Mage on the bottom of his deck instead of in the graveyard.
Yeah, that one goes away as well. His hand, Force of Will, Spell Pierce, another Brainstorm, a Flusterstorm, and another Snapcaster Mage. He is at the ready. Here's Bitter Blossom. Sam does not want that one to resolve. He's going to Brainstorm in response. He has a Snapcaster in hand, so he should be able to counter here.
Right, and if Tomajko fights too hard over this, the Spell Pierce in Roukas' hand will counter the Bitter Blossom.
Puts cards back with Brainstorm. Counterbounce, shows Snapcaster Mage. No Bitter Blossom for Tomajko. Follow-up is Thoughtseize. Now we know that this is cleared to go. Flusterstorm will counter the Thoughtseize. And we know there's a 2 on top. It's Snapcaster Mage.
Right. Luckily for Tomajko, there are not actually very many 2s in his deck. Bitter Blossom was a pretty important one to counter, and Snapcaster Mage is just a good card, right? So it's this spot where Tomajko's thinking, all right, well, this is my window, but also, yikes.
Yeah, looking at the 2-mana plays, Tomajko has 4 copies of Dark Confidant. He has a Young Pyromancer, he has Bitter Blossom, and he has 2 copies of Daze, and that's going to be it for the 2s. And after the counter spell here, the Thoughtseize will resolve, so we see Spell Pierce, Flusterstorm, Swords to Plowshares, and Force of Will at the ready for Sam. Top card is Snapcaster Mage, remember. Both players know that one.
This is going to be tough to pick apart. Roukas just has a bunch of spells, including Swords to Plowshares, and anything that Tomajko takes is something that Snapcaster Mage can just flash back.
Not to mention, there's a Brainstorm in that graveyard, so Counterbalance is doing a lot of work. Snapcaster on Brainstorm is likely to counter anything.
Right, and the way that Tomajko can get back into this game is if he can just find copies of Arclight Phoenix and then have them not get exiled.
Yeah.
And it sounds a little, that's a kind of a tall order with the Swords to Plowshares in Roukas' hand. But these are the games that we see Miracles winning against the Grixis Phoenix deck, are the ones where we get to turn 100, and it feels like Roukas has a pseudo-lock online.
All right, Cabal Therapy from Tomajko. Sam says Counterbalance trigger on. And he actually really wants his Therapy to get countered, so he will use the Snapcaster Mage to Brainstorm a 1 to the top of the deck.
And this is a point where, from Roukas' side of the table, you're kind of thinking most of Tomajko's spells are 1-drops anyway. So this is pretty close to a Time Walk that also counters a spell.
It does mean Bitter Blossom may work, and it does. The top card from Sam was a Portent. Sam hits for 2, but 3 mana is back to basics. He snags 3 of Oliver's lands. And he's going to cast Portent, but right now the Bitter Blossom looks to be for the better. Now, Sam's going to use the other one on Portent. Portent, you can look at either player's top 3 cards, and he's actually looking at Oliver's top 3 and rearranging those.
And, you know, while spotting matches in the feature match area this weekend, Roukas has been on our backup table several times, stacking other players' decks when he knows that he's in a spot where he just kind of needs to maintain parity.
Okay.
Because, you know, when you have a million lands in play, you're kind of under the assumption when your deck has more card selection, you'll find the cards you need eventually. It's making sure your opponent doesn't do something to just, you know, kick your teeth in the meantime.
Sam, top 3. Looks like he only wants 1 of those. He's important to himself, and then he will shuffle. Yeah, but how do we get rid of this Bitter Blossom? I mean, Snapcaster Mage traded for the first Fairy Rogue, but I am looking at Sam's list. You know, he has 2 copies of Council's Judgment. I'm not sure that he's kept those in. They're pretty situational in this matchup.
So that's something that the black decks have been using as a grindy tool for a while now, if we're being honest. So it's hard to imagine that he doesn't have Council's Judgment in his deck, since it can also answer copies of Arclight Phoenix as well.
Okay. Well, here's Jace the Mind Sculptor, and Oliver, despite having Bitter Blossom in play, has seen enough. He picks up the cards.
Right, that's just the point where Roukas is going to get to see so many cards and have a 1-drop on top of his deck for the rest of the game.
So I want to say, the Oliver did have a Bitter Blossom in play. Is it unreasonable to think he could attack down the Jace with Fairy Rogues?
It's a little unreasonable. So there's a point where Roukas can also just put a Terminus on top.
Or just cast one?
You know, either way. It's not exactly difficult to protect this Jace when there also comes a point where you can just roll up the Jace the turn after, or the turn you play your sweeper, and it's going to take so long in order to actually fight down the Jace there. So Tomajko likely just thinks that the time on the clock is more valuable than the 5% that he ends up pulling that game out.
I mean, you don't have to convince me that, like, I don't want to really play a 10-minute game against an onboard Jace the Mind Sculptor. It's not
back to basics.
And yeah, I would. That doesn't sound like fun.
Right, and so I want to point out something from Roukas' side, where having that back to basics in his deck points out a distinct plan, where we ragged on it going into the game a little bit, saying, you know, you're not going to have time to do this, but Roukas has kind of identified that the games he wins are going to require that element in his plan in order to make sure that Tomajko doesn't just keep firing on all cylinders. What Back to Basics is doing here is it's actually just hurting the efficacy of Tomajko's cantrips. There are a ton of cards that help Tomajko churn through his library and find the cards that he needs, but Back to Basics makes it to where the actual blue sources in your deck aren't going to keep on tapping, and so Tomajko is put in a position where he's a finite number of blue spells, or spells in general, that he can even resolve. So the games that Roukas ends up winning, those games look like games where Back to Basics is incredible and likely a large part of that game plan.
So we do head to game 3. Now, one of the things that I was looking at with the Grixis Phoenix deck is the idea is that Arclight Phoenix can give you some extra push in the late game. I feel like against other, like Grixis Delver, that's going to come up a lot. These Phoenixes coming back and back.
Right.
The way this has played out, I don't see, if it gets to turn 7, even though Oliver has Phoenix in his deck, I don't feel like he's going to be able to get there.
Right, and the big difference here is that the removal and the answers that Miracles has to Phoenixes are much more permanent than the ones
Terminus,
that Grixis has.
Swords to Plowshares, Surgical Extraction, Council's Judgment.
Right, these are things that put Arclight Phoenix gone. Wherever that gone is, bottom of the library, exile, etc. Those Phoenixes aren't just going to come back if Tomajko casts Thoughtseize, Therapy, Ponder. Whereas Grixis Delver has Lightning Bolt, Fatal Push, Dismember, Forked Bolt, those types of cards, which all put Arclight Phoenix right where it wants to be, in the graveyard.
Right.
What is the graveyard if not just your other battlefield?
Yeah, graveyard, that's just your second hand.
Exactly.
Both players keeping on 7 for our third game. Oliver starts with Ponder. Actually, the master Cabal therapist here. He does have a therapy in his hand. But right now, it's 2 cards to the bottom with Preordain. And we see either Buried Alive or Dark Ritual. We might see a fast start. But no, it's Ponder from Oliver. Finds a Arclight Phoenix, a Thoughtseize, 1 more. Still setting up as of now. And he likes to seize in that Thoughtseize, but not going to fire it off just yet. He actually says go.
Right, and likely what he's doing here is just trying to represent any kind of response to a counterbalance, or just trying to give Roukas more shots to find the cards he actually wants to Thoughtseize. This also gives him the ability to fight over the Thoughtseize with this Flusterstorm in his hand.
I like this a lot, what I just saw from Oliver. So it's a Thoughtseize. There's 2 copies of Swords to Plowshares in Sam's hand, and Oliver's leading on Thoughtseize. If he looks at Sam's hand and sees that 2 of, you know where the Cabal therapy is going to go.
Oh, and Roukas just lets it resolve.
Because he cast Containment Priest. So it's 2 lands, Ponder, Force of Will, and 2 Swords to Plowshares. If that other card in Oliver's hand is Cabal Therapy, this is going to be pretty brutal.
My, Roukas. What a nice hand you've got there.
Yeah, that is
a shame if something happened to it.
Yeah, he's already pushed that Cabal Therapy up to the front. If he has a 3rd land, Oliver can take everything. So he'll start by taking Ponder. Now he's fetching. Yeah, 2 cards with the same name. Don't mind if I do.
Oh, he's letting Roukas pick up his hand. That's just cruel.
Well, let's name Swords to Plowshares.
Roukas just putting the swords in the graveyard.
Yeah, Contain Priest, Cat Saxon for 2, and that might keep him alive for a bit. Oliver did not have a 3rd land.
It's also worth noting this Priest is keeping in check the ways that Tomajko would actually close the game.
Yeah, he has these Buried Alives in his hand. He can't cast them right now, and even if he could, I'm not sure they do much. Oliver, out of the board, does not have very much removal. So
no,
Containment Priest might just be here.
Right. At this point, Tomajko is likely just looking at Snare Thopters, hoping that they're good enough.
Thoughtseize again leaves Roukas with just Terminus. But Oliver, again, even after Brainstorm, misses the 3rd land, and this is big. And, okay, Sam attacks with Monastery Mentor. Hold on. We might not care.
Hits the table.
Ooh. Yeah. You can Thoughtseize him all you want. He's going to beat you down with some 2/2s.
Who needs a hand?
Oliver just can't find lands.
Well, at that point, it's hard to see what he would even be doing with them. The cards in his hand don't answer what's on the battlefield.
No, plays a fetch land. He's down to 10. Sam attacks for 4. Oliver's down to 6.
Listen,
this is going to work.
Sometimes all you need is a grizzly bear. Or 2.
And Oliver can't do it. He extends the hand, and the medium